Court story. Luffy woke up in a rather unfamiliar room. He was lying on a soft bed, different from the hammocks he was used to. The pain in his stomach was so intense he had to squeeze his eyes shut and bite his tongue to avoid yelling out. He slowly opened his eyes, tasting blood. The pain was something he had come to live with after his battle with Crocodile a short while ago. After his body had come to terms with the pain, he sat up and looked around, recognizing the sea charts as a navigator's work. Nami's room, he thought to himself. What am I doing here? The answer became clear to him as he remembered the events of last night. Well, shit, he muttered. Luffy rolled out of bed, amazed at how much more comfortable Nami's bed was to his own. A familiar empty feeling filled his stomach. Food. He shot out of the room and into the kitchen, only to find the rest of his crew already in there playing cards. He froze, only just noticing the sun, which was already most of the way through its course. He slowly returned his gaze to the rest of his crew who were eyeing him in a strange way. Slowly, Luffy's brain began to catch up to what was going on. He remembered the events of that morning. Being bored, training with Zoro, finding Nami, being alone. Nami beside him, falling asleep. His eyes widened as he observed his crew for a third time. He locked eyes with his navigator who was staring up at him with a concerned expression on her face. Not knowing what else to do, Luffy laughed. Haha, you should see the look on your faces, he said, still happily grinning away. He then turned to his cook, who pointed to a hot meal sitting on the bench. Luffy ran over to it, devouring it all before he even got to the table. He sat down with his empty plate anyway, for the sake of being with his crew, who were currently staring at him with a look of complete awe, somehow still surprised by their captain's insane ability to devour food. Luffy grinned up at them. You want in? Zoro, who was about to deal a new hand, asked. Luffy shrugged and agreed. After a few hours, the crew gave up on their card games and slowly drifted off to do their own things. Nami wandered off to the front of the ship, staring up at the clouds. Zoro went back to his training, this time accompanied by Usopp. Sanji got to work on the dishes. Luffy followed Chopper to his small makeshift clinic for a routine check-in. Luffy pulled his shirt over his head and turned to Chopper. The reindeer was busy laying out clean bandages, but froze as he turned to face his captain, a look of horror spreading across his face. Luffy looked down at the doctor, concerned. What is it, Chopper? He asked. Chopper raised his head to meet Luffy's gaze, and then lowered it back to Luffy's stomach. Luffy sat down on the bed, looking at the doctor with concern. Luffy, Chopper asked, his voice weak. Yeah, Luffy responded, curious. How long has it looked like that? Chopper was shivering, horrified. Luffy once again looked down at the wound on his stomach. The skin around the wound was horribly bruised and agitated, and incredibly painful. The wound itself looked horrific, despite the stitches that held it closed. The discoloring of the skin continued to the edges of the wound, which were peeling back from each other. Thick, congealed blood sat just inside the gaping hole between the stitches. Luffy looked back up at the doctor and shrugged. I dunno, a few days, he said, completely unaffected. Just wait here a second. The reindeer squeaked, running out of the door. Luffy pushed himself further up the bed and crossed his arms behind his head, leaning onto the wall. Promoted stories. You'll also like 3D2YA One Piece fanfic. 367K 6.1K. Luffy stumbles upon Nami by chance on a small island after the crew was separated at Sabayati Archipelago. The two decide to train together, but then comes the warm, weird, mysterious girl on the Straw Hat ship 1. 5.7K 298. YN, a kind, lovely and beautiful girl who died while saving puppy god Transmigrat into World of Pirates. She Also have unique power, as long as she wish any anime power. One Piece Anime, 5.7K27. In this story, it will be about a girl who lost her brother when she was little and was taken in by a young boy named Luffy. A boy who said he would become king of the P. My brother's keepsake, Sabo X Reader. 125K 4.8K. After the death of Portgas D. Ace, the Navy wished to prevent the continuation of the bloodline of the Pirate King. They send soldiers to an island on the Grand Line where the rising moon, One Piece, 1.7K 178. 2 years had passed since the War of the Best, along with the Straw Hat being sent flying from Sabayati Archipelago due to the former warlord, Kuma. With the 2 years P. Broken Hearts Doflamingo X Reader. 4.4K 325. A woman who has had several adventures with her crew has recently encountered an island that would bring her and her crew into ultimate doom. Losing her captain and her. Gomen, Captain. 41.2K 1.3K. Book 1. No regrets, right, it's been 2 years since the Battle of Marineford. 2 years since the Straw Hats were separated. After taking off from Amazon Lily with Law, Nami was sure of it now they were approaching land. Judging by the air temperature, she thought it might be tropical, but she wasn't quite sure. Whatever it was, she judged that it was within a day's travel away. She sighed, glad to have some good news to give to her restless captain. A hurried pitter-patter on the deck caught her attention. Chopper was walking around in circles, hooves pressed into his head, clearly upset about something. Nami pushed herself to her feet and walked over, placing a tentative hand on the doctor's shoulder. Chopper whirled around, turning to face the stranger. Upon seeing that it was Nami, he relaxed and dropped into a sitting position, putting his head in his hands. Nami, now worried, squatted down next to him and started rubbing his back. "What's wrong, Chopper?" she asked. The doctor turned to face her, saying nothing, before sighing and standing up. He beckoned for her to follow, and so she did. The little doctor led her back to the medicinal quarters and opened the door, gesturing for her to enter. She did. Luffy was in there, leaning on the wall in a lazy manner. Upon hearing the door open, he turned his head to greet the newcomer. "Hey Nami," he chirped, beaming up at his navigator. Nami smiled back, giving a little wave. "Hey Lou." She froze, finally noticing the horrific scene on Luffy's stomach. She gasped, stumbling. Chopper came in behind her and sat himself in his seat and put his head back in his hands. Luffy frowned at Nami, unsure of what they were all so worried about. The poor girl was shivering away, staring down at her stupid captain. "Luffy," she whispered, dropping into a squat beside the bed. Luffy ruffled her hair and grinned at her. "What's the big deal?" he said, curious. "It's just a cut." Nami shook her head in response, a tear sliding down her cheek. Luffy panicked, pulling himself forward so he was sitting in front of his navigator. "Hey," he said, concerned, wiping the tear away. "Please don't cry, I'm okay." Nami looked up at her captain, wide-eyed and pale. She stood up, slowly, and wrapped her arms around her captain, placing one on his back and nodding the other into the back of his head and pulling him close. Luffy, despite how painful the embrace was, tentatively patted her on the back. By this point, Chopper had recovered. He stood up and placed a hand on Nami's knee, too short to reach her shoulder. Nami unwillingly let go of her stunned captain who winced and sat back down, sucking a breath in. "I'm sorry," she started, realizing that she had hurt him. He smiled up at her. "No, it's fine," he said. Chopper sat Nami down in his chair and took a deep breath preparing to deal with Luffy. Heavy footsteps sounded and Zoro appeared in the doorway, looking nervous. Chopper looked up from where he was pulling on his gloves. Zoro started, stepping into the room. Usopp was slung over his shoulder. I kinda squished Usop, he said, raising his free hand to scratch the back of his head. Luffy burst out laughing, bringing Zoro's attention to him. Luffy watched the blood drain from his swordsman's face as he stared down at him, accidentally dropping Usop in the process. Chopper ran forwards to help the sniper up, leaning him up against the bed where Luffy was sitting. Shit, Luffy, Zoro muttered, staring down at his captain. Luffy, ignorant as he was, continued to laugh. How the hell did you manage to squish Usop? He chuckled, but then froze, his eyebrows drawing closer together. He raised his hand to his mouth as his laughter turned into a coughing fit. Zoro rushed forwards and held his captain up. Luffy winced, drawing a blood-soaked hand away from his mouth. Geez. He croaked, his throat raw. Despite everything, he chuckled. Zoro gawped up at him, in shock. Usopp groaned from where he lay on the floor. Chopper lifted him up and sat him on the bed beside Luffy, who now had blood trickling from his nose and mouth. Chopper rubbed his head as Zoro shuffled over to sit on the ground beside Nami, who was still in shock. Did you bring him in here? He asked her. Nami shook her head. Chopper came out onto the deck in a panic and led me back here, she whispered. I think Crocodile did that to him. Zoro's eyes widened in shock as the image of his battered and bleeding captain stumbling into a lubarna made its way into his mind. Of course, he muttered. He had completely forgotten about that. Of course, only Chopper knew how severe the wound was, but even he was shocked by Luffy's current state. It was at that moment that Sanji appeared in the doorway. Hey Chopper, he called. Where is everyone? Oh. Sanji stuck his head in the door. What are you guys doing here? In response to the cook's question, Zoro pointed at Usopp and Nami pointed at her captain. Sanji turned to face them, freezing in the doorway. Chopper had injected some kind of strange fluid into Luffy and ordered him to lay down on the bed, before getting to work on Usopp's head. What happened here, Zoro? The doctor asked his green-haired companion. Zoro winced. Well, the idiot wanted to train with me, he started. Sanji sat down on the opposite side of Nami. He had been unable to see Luffy's wound because he was now wrapped in a sheet, eyes fading in and out of focus. Zoro continued, so I let him, but I forgot that I'm slightly stronger. Sanji scoffed at this, but for once, Zoro paid him no attention. So I chucked him a weight and it squished him. Upon hearing this, the barely conscious Luffy started chuckling away. Chopper, being in his analysis mood, didn't react in any way except to nod at this point. Usopp looked like a mummy, completely wrapped in bandages except for his eyes and mouth. Zoro looked guilty. Luffy was now completely out of it, chest rising and falling with the slow, peaceful rhythm of sleep. Without meaning to, Nami caught herself staring. So what's up with the captain? Sanji asked, lighting a cigarette. Chopper sighed. I'll get to him in a second. Best let the drug settle in properly before we begin. Nami gulped upon hearing the word, beggin. Chopper looked up at Zoro as he pulled various bandages and ointments out of the drawers surrounding the room. Could you move Usopp to his bunk? He asked, distracted. Zoro stood without a word and slung Usopp back over his shoulder. Nami, despite knowing the strength and capability of the men she was surrounded by, couldn't help but shudder at how easily he did it. He made Usopp look like a ragdoll made of helium. Sanji stood as Chopper pulled his stool over to the bed, still curious as to what was going on with Luffy. Nami also stood up, shuffling over to help Chopper with her sleeping captain. Chopper asked her to draw back the sheets, and she did, breath catching as she exposed the gaping hole in her captain's gut. Behind her, she heard Sanji gasp in shock. When did that happen? He asked, voice shaky. Nami, Having pulled the sheet off her captain's torso and tucked it into the bed to hold it in place, turned to Sanji to offer an explanation. "Remember when Chopper showed up on that giant crab to pick us up in Alabasta?" she asked him, trying to jog his memory, despite the ordeal having taken place not so long ago. Sanji nodded. "You know how we left Luffy behind to fight Crocodile, and told him to meet us in Alubarna?" Again, Sanji nodded. "Well, I think he got this fighting Crocodile that time. You saw how powerful Crocodile was. It was impossible to hit him. Luffy would have been defenseless. And then Crocodile showed up in Alubarna, proving that Luffy didn't kick his ass as promised. And knowing Luffy, if his target didn't lose, then he did. There is no way he'd let Crocodile get away when he could still fight." This time, Sanji's nod was much more slow and thoughtful. "Nami," Chopper piped up, stealing her attention from the cook. Nami looked down at him. "Could you hold onto his head?" the doctor asked. Nami couldn't help but question her friend's intentions with her captain, but gave him the benefit of the doubt, climbing onto the bed and lifting her captain's head into her lap and holding it there. She would have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile etched there for a split second, but it was soon gone. Zoro strolled back into the room. "Usopp free. Right, you two?" Chopper said, sending them a dead serious expression. "Take half each."